Hey, y'all asked for it. It's the Bedrock type study. But first things first, y'all know I got to identify my sources. So John Walter in Antique and Collectible Stanley Tools, he's got a copy of the Bedrock type study in there. And it's also in P. Tampia, Volume 2. But credit for the actual type study goes to Bob Kaune. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop the link to this into the video description. So y'all sit back, relax, and let's talk about some Bedrocks. We're going to kick things off with Type 1, naturally. So what makes a Bedrock is going to be that frog design right there. Virtually 100% contact between the bottom of the frog and the frog bed on the plane. And how do we know a Type 1? Well, there's a few telltale signs. One, they had not adopted this 60X numbering system yet. So a Type 1 is still going to say number 6. Other than that, you're going to have an S casting mark usually. And you might find it here underneath the tote. You're also going to have the milled out additional patent date under here. And I want to invite everybody to watch part 2 of this video to learn more about the ins and outs of these things. But right now, we're just focused on just typing and how you know that a Type 1 is a Type 1. Another distinguishing characteristic, I know you can't see it on here because this lateral adjust is so old and pitted, but there would be 2 patent dates on there, and that's another distinguishing feature of the frog on a Type 1. Some other things to know about the early Bedrocks as we go through, we'll talk about them, but your Q logo or Q trademark for your irons, that's what that looks like. And you are going to have the 3-line lever cap like that, Stanley R&L Co. Bedrock. Of course, Stanley Rule and Level Company. And you are going to have a B casting mark on that. So despite the S casting in the bed, it's going to be a B casting on the lever cap. Last and certainly not least, you're going to have a low knob, which is going to correspond with the Bailey pattern planes from the same time period. And you're going to have your tote is going to be shaped the same. So this, we're talking Type 7, Type 8 era equivalent for the Stanley Bailey pattern. On the Bedrock side, same exact tote. And they are going to be all solid brass barrel nuts during this time. Production on the Type 1 started in 1898. By 1899, we're going to what we now call Type 2s. And the only difference between a Type 1 and a Type 2 is that we drop 1 patent date off of the lateral adjust lever. So we went from 2 down to 1, so this is going to be 7/24/88. And I know that's tough to see, but that's the only difference. Type 2, single patent date on the lateral adjust. There is a subtype out there called a Type 2 Alpha. It only affects the earliest 603s, but they got the 603 moniker, the 60X, before any other types. So, pretty inconsequential, but just so you know that it's out there. Type 2 Alpha, 603s only. For our Type 3s, what we see is we now have the 60X numbering system. You're always going to see that, you know, number 603, number 604 as applicable. You're going to have a B casting mark usually in the bed, starting with the Type 3s. Perhaps most importantly, you're no longer going to have the additional patent date milled out underneath the first one. For the most part, your Type 3s are going to look a lot like your earlier types as far as the 3-line lever cap like so. Still have the Q logo on the iron. The shape of the tote still matches the Stanley Bailey pattern from the same time period. One other anomaly that you might see is the milled surface on the front of the frog may be nickel plated. You may see that out there. I personally have never seen that, but if you have, you know, I'd love to see a picture of it. We still have the B casting on the frog. You can just barely see it there. It usually shows up in the center like that. Small brass adjuster, and then, of course, frog adjustment screw. So all the other things remain the same. Moving right along, we are on Type 4. Some differences for Type 4s. The B casting mark is now gone from the bed. You won't see that there. Patent dates gone from the lateral adjust lever. See? No patent date. Oh, wait, that's not right. Patent dates gone from the lateral adjust lever. Just like that. Another major change, the lever caps. Instead of having the 3-line, now we go to a 2-line lever cap. So just Stanley Bedrock. Looks like that. And one more significant change, instead of the Q logo, we now see the T trademark or T logo. Looks just like that. Or you might see the S trademark that looks just like that, just Stanley. Everything else still carrying over. So shape of the tote, small brass adjuster, low knob, rest of the stuff just carrying right over. Single patent date back there, or it might be behind the frog depending on the size of the plane. From Type 4 to Type 5 has got to be the most significant change in the entire Bedrock lineup. And we should take a look at what those changes are. First thing, you now have Bedrock cast into the bed. And that's in addition to, of course, the 600 series number. So 604, 604 and a half. I know that might be tough to see. 603, note how it's down on the toe instead of above the knob. And also, no more bee casting marks in the bed or on the frogs. The bee casting marks are gone. We naturally have the flat top sides now added. So up to Type 4 we had the round sides. Now we got flat. We now have 2 patent dates in the bed versus our 1. So we've got the old April 2nd of 95 still hanging out. We also now add April 19th of what is 1910. So a pair of patent dates now. We also have a raised ring under our front knob. And it's important to note that on your Type 14s for the Bailey pattern, that knob actually sinks down into that raised ring. So it's more like a receiver. Whereas on the Bedrocks, it sits on top of the ring. And that is important to note, especially when you're ordering replacement parts. You still want the straight base here on the knob. You don't want to get the one that has the tapered base because it's not going to sink into the ring. And speaking of knobs, this is also where we go from the low to the high knob. And perhaps the most significant change of all, when we go from the Type 4 to the Type 5 Bedrocks, is we see the introduction of the pins and screws to hold our frogs. So we no longer have just a straight screw that's holding our frog down. We now have a pin that goes through. It's got the opening in the back like so, and you're going to actually insert this screw with a pointed end, and it's going to hold that in place like that. More specifically, for demonstration purposes, pin, and then your screw is going to go into the body, and it's going to line up and hold that pin in place. This is what is truly unique about the Bedrock, specifically your flat sides, is you can move the frog, so you can adjust it to close up the mouth without removing your lever cap and your iron. So you just back these screws off. You're going to move your frog adjustment screw and then tighten those back down, and you've now closed up the mouth. I'll go into more detail on part 2, but for our purposes, Type 5, you may see the T trademark, you may see the V trademark. And we're moving, we're now on Type 6. You will notice that I left the same planes on the bench because the bodies themselves, no substantial changes. Starting with the lever caps, we have now gone from the 2-line Bedrock lever cap over to the single-line Bedrock. And you will remember, because it was mere seconds ago, it's a V logo for a lot of Type 6, but toward the end, we go over to the X logo or X trademark, and that's what that looks like. I've got some other videos that cover this, but Stanley, SW, Sweetheart or Stanley Works, and then the New Britain, Connecticut. That's what separates the X logo or X trademark. And as I mentioned, I will go into more detail on part 2. That's where we're going to get into the weeds. Other than that, is during the what we now call the Type 6 era, and maybe edging into Type 6 Alpha, is when we go from the 1-inch brass that we've had all along up to this time over to the 1.25 inch. And speaking of the 6 Alpha, Type 6 Alpha, we're also going to see the introduction of the Y trademark, and that's what that looks like. Type 7 brings us another fairly significant change. That 1895 patent date has finally dropped off. So we've gone from the 2 down to the 1, and it's the 1910 patent date. We've also made our way to the 3rd and final Sweetheart trademark, and that's what that looks like. This, of course, being the AA trademark. During Type 7, it was also when the 605 1/4 was introduced. Unfortunately, I don't have one of those to show you, so you just have to use your imagination. And last and most certainly not least, we have now lost Bedrock off of our lever caps. This is where we went to the Stanley rectangle on the front of the lever caps. Looks like that. And I know I promised to wait until part 2 of the video to get into the weeds, but let me just show you this one detail. If you look, you will notice that there is Japanning on the, behind that Stanley, in the shadows, if you will. None here. This is the Bedrock version. This is what I believe, and talking to some other Bedrock aficionados, this is what the Bedrock caps had. So the back of them, the same. So I'm curious to hear, those of you that are watching this video that are big into Bedrocks, drop a comment in here. Let me know what you've seen. Let me know which of your Type 7 and later Bedrocks have the Japanning in the background. For our Type 8s, we've still got the patent date in the bed. And the parts selling business is not maybe independently wealthy enough yet to be able to sample every single one of these, so you're going to have to deal with that. But we have the addition of Made in USA now in the bed. So Type 8, edition of Made in USA. And the other significant change on Type 8, remember how we talked about this earlier, you got the ring, but the knob actually sits on top of it. Well, it's during Type 8 that we go from having that straight base where it comes straight down to having the tapered base. And the reason for that, of course, is because it's now recessed. So it's more of a receiver where the knob sits down in there, sinks down in there for a better hold, a better fit. We made it to Type 9. We're going to get rid of that patent date. And now we just have Made in USA, of course, still Bedrock in the bed. Everything else the same, what we already talked about. The lever caps have gone through some changes. This is where we see, and the verbiage in the type study is that some are going to be nickel plated and have the orange background behind the Stanley. So remember, this is Type 9 when we see those changes. Loss of the patent date here, and nickel plated with Stanley in orange. We're getting close here, folks. We made it to Type 10. This is not a Bedrock frog, but I'm just showing because the type study mentions that you might see some frogs that have the orange paint on the sides, some specimens, and that's what it'll look like. Again, this is not a Bedrock frog, but just so you can have an idea. Stanley is still in their orange phase, though, because on the lever caps, we now see the introduction in 1933 of our kidney hole, and then it's that pretty orange there in the background, and they are going to be nickel plated like you see there. And for the first couple of years, you're going to still see that Sweetheart trademark like that. But in 1936 is when we see the introduction of the BB trademark. And that's what that looks like. And kind of as a side note, because I don't have a really great example for you. Remember the older ones, remember the two patent dates or Type 5s, Type 6s. They had this flat back here on like the 603, 604s. Well, on the Type 10s, which is what we're talking about here, that 603, 604, 605 and a quarter, they get a little raised boss, if you will, underneath the tote. This obviously is a 605, and I don't have a good one to show you. So when you see them out there in the wild, it's another indicator that you're looking at, when you're trying 603, 604, that's an indicator you're talking about a Type 10. To get into what we now call Type 11, it's now 1942. The U.S. is entering the war. Stanley's doing, wartime production stuff. So they're going to have a thicker casting. As a matter of fact, it might look a little like that right there. That's a little thicker casting on that cheek. As well as we're going to see the going away of the nickel plating, the polishing of the caps, also the orange. So it's going to be a plain cap like this. Stanley's cutting production wherever they can. And so that's going to be our Type 11s. For our Type 12s, the year is now 1943. The U.S. is embroiled in World War II. No more brass for the production of hand planes, at least for the most part. So we've got this small 1-inch steel adjuster. You might see the rubber adjuster like that, aka gutta percha. You might even see a little variation. See, there might be some brass hanging around. You might see either one of those. And again, no brass, so no brass barrel nuts. So we're going to be seeing this all steel screw right there. And the rosewood is also going away for the most part. This is from a, Stanley Bailey pattern. May have been on a Bedrock or two. But for the most part, per the type study, it's going to be that hard maple with like a varnish finish on it. Other than that, the other features remain the same as far as having, Made in USA, having the Bedrock on there. No patent dates. Frogs remain the same. We talked about the adjusters. Still the no finish, no nickel plating or polish on the lever cap. Still going to be a BB logo. So for the rest of the features for the Type 12s, it's going to remain the same. And that's a wrap, y'all. And oh, by the way, with the exception of that 604.5, everything that you just saw in that video is for sale. So if you need some Bedrock parts, be sure to let me know. And don't forget to like and subscribe.